Late 1970s, BBC Studios, London. In the dusty, heavy atmosphere where Britain's most prestigious cultural programs were filmed, two men sat in leather chairs. On one side, a famous presenter with an Oxford accent and a needling smile, representing aristocratic traditionalism. On the other, a young man with long, dark hair falling past his shoulders, shy posture, an energy that seemed to shrink in the studio, the complete opposite of his massive stage presence. Freddie Mercury. The program began normally, but when the recording light came on, the presenter began his famous subtle humiliations targeting not Freddie's music, but his very identity. "Your music style is rather ostentatious, Mr. Mercury," the presenter said, rolling the word ostentatious in his mouth like a curse. "Is this excess perhaps a screen to hide your exotic background? Tell me, on that journey from Zanzibar to London, where exactly did you leave your accent?" Freddie smiled, but that smile came with a reflexive hand covering his mouth, hiding the prominent teeth he'd been insecure about his entire life, hiding his foreign origins. What happened in that interview, and more importantly, what happened afterward in a locked dressing room where Freddie broke down completely, would become the fuel that transformed an insecure immigrant boy into the most confident performer who ever lived. This is the story of the night Freddie Mercury was destroyed on national television, and how he used that destruction to build something indestructible. The late 1970s in London was a complicated time for anyone who didn't fit the traditional British mold. Queen had achieved significant success by this point, hit records, growing concert audiences, critical acclaim for their musical innovation. But success in Britain's class-conscious society came with scrutiny that went beyond music. The cultural gatekeepers, the BBC presenters, the serious music critics, the arbiters of what was properly British, were suspicious of anything too theatrical, too foreign, too different. And Freddie Mercury was all of those things. Born Farrokh Bulsara in Zanzibar, raised in India, arrived in England as a teenage refugee when his family fled revolution, his entire biography was exactly the kind of exotic background that made traditional British cultural authorities uncomfortable. He'd changed his name, worked hard to minimize his accent, reinvented himself as Freddie Mercury. But underneath the stage persona, the insecurity remained, particularly about two things: his teeth and his foreignness. His teeth, that prominent overbite that he believed gave his voice its unique quality, but that had been the source of childhood bullying he was deeply self-conscious about. Throughout his life, he'd habitually cover his mouth when laughing or smiling, a reflexive gesture born from years of being called Bucky and Rabbit Teeth by cruel classmates. And his origins being from Zanzibar, being Parsi, having that slightly different background that made him not quite one of us in the eyes of Britain's cultural establishment, was another source of vulnerability he tried to hide behind the Freddie Mercury persona. The BBC interview was supposed to be a standard cultural program appearance, a prestigious slot on a show that millions watched, a chance to talk about Queen's music and upcoming projects. Freddie had arrived at the studios nervous but hopeful this was mainstream acceptance, validation from the cultural establishment. He was 28 years old. His appearance was quintessentially late 1970s. Freddie, long dark hair falling past his shoulders in natural waves, no mustache yet, that would come in the early 1980s, clean-shaven face showing his prominent teeth whenever he smiled, wearing theatrical clothes that marked him as different from the conservative British norm. The studio itself was intimidating, all that BBC institutional weight, the cameras, the lights, the knowledge that this was being broadcast to living rooms across Britain. Freddie sat in the leather chair trying to project confidence, but those who knew him well could see the protective body language, the way he held himself slightly hunched, the way his hand kept moving toward his mouth. The presenter was in his 50s, perfectly groomed, speaking in that particular Oxford-educated accent that announced class privilege with every syllable. He represented everything old and established about British culture, the gatekeepers who decided what was acceptable and what wasn't. When the camera started rolling, the interview began pleasantly enough. Questions about the new album, about touring, about musical influences. Freddie relaxed slightly, his natural charisma beginning to emerge. Then the tone shifted. Your music style is rather ostentatious, Mr. Mercury, the presenter said, and the way he pronounced ostentatious made it clear this wasn't a compliment. Very theatrical, very excessive. Is this excess perhaps a screen? A way of hiding your more exotic background? Freddie smiled, but it was a nervous smile, and his hand moved reflexively to cover his mouth, that habitual gesture of someone who'd spent years being made fun of for his teeth. I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Freddie said carefully. Well, you weren't born Freddie Mercury, were you? The presenter continued, his smile never reaching his eyes. Your real name is Farrokh Bulsara, I believe. From Zanzibar? That's quite a journey, Zanzibar to London. Tell me, on that journey, where exactly did you leave your accent? Because you speak remarkably good English now. Very impressive for someone from, where was it again? Zanzibar? The way he said Zanzibar made it sound like a punchline. A few technical crew members could be heard chuckling in the background. Freddie's smile faltered. For a moment, the confident performer disappeared, and sitting in that chair was Farrokh Bulsara, the immigrant teenager who'd been made fun of for his accent, the foreign kid who never quite fit in, the boy with the prominent teeth that everyone noticed. But the presenter wasn't finished. There's a theory that your distinctive dental structure visually affects your vocal sound, he continued, his tone suggesting this was casual conversation rather than calculated cruelty. Those prominent front teeth, they create a unique resonance, don't they? Is that why you pronounce certain words so distinctively? Or is that the Zanzibar accent peeking through? More chuckling from the crew. The presenter's smile widened slightly. Farrokh Bulsara, he repeated, as if tasting the name. Doesn't quite have the same ring as Freddie Mercury, does it? Sounds more like a customs official than a rock star. I suppose that's why you changed it? Throughout this, Freddie's hand kept moving to his mouth, covering his teeth. His posture became more hunched, more protective. His eyes, usually so bright and commanding, seemed to dim. The sparkle that made him Freddie Mercury on stage was being systematically extinguished by a man in a nice suit making subtle jabs about teeth and origins and not quite belonging. The interview continued in this vein for another 15 minutes. The presenter never asked about music. Instead, he treated Freddie like a curiosity, an exotic specimen, someone trying to fit into British culture but not quite succeeding, not quite being one of us. Every question was designed to remind Freddie and the audience that he was foreign, different, not quite acceptable to Britain's cultural establishment despite his success. When the interview finally ended, the presenter extended his hand with practiced courtesy. But his eyes held that cold superiority, the look of someone who just put an upstart in his place, reminded him of the hierarchy, made it clear that success didn't mean acceptance. The camera stopped. The lights dimmed. The crew began packing equipment, already moving on to the next segment, already forgetting about the immigrant rock singer they just laughed at. Freddie stood up, his head bowed, and walked toward the dressing room. His movements were mechanical, his usual theatrical grace completely gone. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, like the interview had physically shrunk him. He entered the dressing room, closed the door behind him, and turned the lock with a quiet click. The silence of the room made the mocking laughter still echoing in his ears even louder. He walked to the mirror, that full-length mirror that reflected back a young man who looked nothing like the confident performer who commanded stages. He removed the silk jacket he'd worn for the interview, theatrical, expensive, part of the Freddie Mercury costume. Underneath, he was just Farrokh again, just the foreign kid with the prominent teeth and the background that would never be quite British enough. He gripped the edge of the makeup table, staring at his reflection, his long, dark hair framing a face that showed every year of trying to fit in, trying to be accepted, trying to be enough. Slowly, he raised his hand to his mouth, touching his teeth, those teeth that gave his voice its unique quality, but that had been the source of so much insecurity, so much mockery throughout his life. The presenter's words echoed in his head. Those prominent front teeth. Why you pronounce words so distinctively. Farrokh Bulsara sounds like a customs official. And something inside him broke. Tears began streaming down his face. Not elegant theatrical tears, but the raw, ugly crying of someone who'd been holding it together for too long. Someone who'd been pretending to be confident while feeling like an imposter. Someone who'd just had their deepest insecurities broadcast to millions of people. He looked at himself in the mirror at Farouk Bulsara, the immigrant boy who would never be British enough, never be accepted enough, never be one of them no matter how successful he became. He whispered to his reflection, his voice breaking, "I'll never be English enough, will I? No matter how many songs I sing, no matter how big the concerts, to them, I'll always be that foreign kid, always the other, always not quite belonging." It was a moment of complete devastation, the kind of breaking point where everything you've built to protect yourself crumbles, and you're left facing the raw truth of your deepest fears. The Freddie Mercury persona, the confident rock star, the commanding performer, hadn't been enough to protect him from this. In that BBC studio, with those cameras and that presenter and those laughing crew members, he'd been reduced to exactly what he'd always feared: a foreigner trying too hard, someone who didn't belong, someone to be mocked and dismissed. He stared at his reflection, seeing all his inadequacies reflected back: the teeth, the foreign name, the exotic background, the accent he'd worked so hard to minimize, all of it exposed and ridiculed on national television. For several minutes, he just cried, let himself feel the full weight of the humiliation, the rejection, the confirmation of his worst fears about himself. But then slowly, gradually, something changed. In that locked dressing room, in front of that mirror, something hardened inside Freddie Mercury. His crying slowed, his breathing steadied, and his eyes, those eyes that had looked so defeated moments before, began to burn with something else. Something fierce, something angry, something defiant. He wiped the tears from his face with the back of his hand, his jaw setting with determination. He looked at his reflection again, but this time he wasn't seeing Farouk Bulsara, the victim. He was seeing Freddie Mercury, the survivor, the fighter, the one who would turn this pain into power. He straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin, met his own eyes in the mirror with growing intensity. They want to humiliate me, he said to his reflection, his voice no longer trembling, but steady with conviction. They want to remind me I'm foreign, that I don't belong, that I'm different. He paused, and a smile began to form, not the nervous smile that covered his teeth, but a smile of pure, fierce determination. Then I'll give them different. I'll give them so much excess, so much theater, so much larger-than-life spectacle, that they'll have no choice but to bow before it. If they're going to mock me anyway, I'll give them something so magnificent they can't look away. He touched his teeth again, but this time not with shame. This time with recognition that they were part of what made his voice unique, part of what made him Freddie Mercury. Every time you belittle me, he said, his voice growing stronger, every word you use to make me feel small, it's just another step for me to climb higher. You want to laugh at the boy from Zanzibar? Fine, but damn me, that boy is going to build something so enormous that you'll need to crane your neck just to see the bottom of it. In that moment, in that locked dressing room, Freddie Mercury made a choice. He could let the humiliation define him, or he could use it as fuel. He could shrink from the mockery, or he could build something so undeniably magnificent that the mockers would have no choice but to acknowledge it. He chose magnitude. He chose spectacle. He chose to transform every insult into inspiration, every moment of "you don't belong" into "I belong everywhere because I say so." From that night forward, Freddie Mercury changed. The shy young man who covered his mouth when he smiled began to disappear. In his place emerged the performer in capes and crowns, the showman who commanded stadiums with a single gesture, the rock god who threw his head back and displayed those prominent teeth to 100,000 people without a moment's shame. His stage costumes became more elaborate, not despite the criticism, but because of it. If they thought he was too theatrical, too excessive, too foreign, too different, well then, he'd give them theatrical and excessive and different on a scale they'd never imagined. The capes got longer, the crowns got bigger, the performances became more spectacular. He stopped trying to fit into their boxes. and instead built his own palace. He rose above the mockery like a colossus, so huge they had to acknowledge him, so magnificent they had to respect him, whether they wanted to or not. Years later, when 72,000 people at Wembley Stadium sang in unison at his command, when he conducted audiences like an orchestra with a single movement of his hand, when the entire world recognized him as one of the greatest performers who ever lived, Freddie would sometimes remember that BBC studio, that mocking presenter, those cruel questions about his teeth and his name and his origins. And he would smile, because none of it mattered anymore. No one cared about his accent, his original name, or his teeth. They cared about Freddie Mercury, the legend he'd built from the broken pieces of Farouk Bulsara's heart. For those of us who are now in our 60s and 70s, who remember what it was like to face discrimination, to be told we didn't belong, to have our differences mocked, Freddie's story resonates deeply. The greatest revenge isn't anger or bitterness, it's success. It's building something so undeniably magnificent that the people who said you can't or you don't belong become irrelevant. Freddie Mercury took Farouk Bulsara's broken heart and built the world's greatest icon. That young man crying in the dressing room that night actually crowned himself, because he learned to transform humiliation into gold, mockery into music, every "you're not enough" into "I'm more than you can imagine." Today, when people say Freddie Mercury, no one talks about a foreigner. They talk about the pinnacle of human artistry and will, about transcendence, about someone who became so magnificently himself that the world had no choice but to worship. Every time you belittled me, you actually made me bigger. Thank you, darlings, because now, from up here, I can't even see you anymore. The presenter who mocked him that night, history doesn't even remember his name. But Freddie Mercury, he became immortal. That's not revenge, that's transformation. That's taking everything meant to destroy you and using it to build something indestructible. Thank you for the insults. They became my crown. Good night, darlings, from the top.